Hey there, it's Catherine with GriefInspired, and I have a question for you. Do you know what emotional triggers are, and have you experienced an emotional trigger as it relates to your grief recently? Well, if you have, this video is for you. We are going to talk through what an emotional trigger is. I'm going to share something from my experience, and then I'm going to tell you what you can do when these emotional triggers show up. So stay tuned. So I want to share a story with you. I recently just had double carpal tunnel surgery. That's why I haven't been texting quite as much as I normally do. If you haven't gotten messages back from me, that might be why. But I'm healing up just fine. But something happened while I was at the doctor, and it was an emotional trigger for me. And it was something that really just came up out of the blue. Now, because I was having double carpal tunnel surgery, they're cutting into both of my hands. Normally they would put an IV in your hand or your arm, but they didn't want to do that because that's where surgery was going to be, and they were going to have to use like tourniquets on my arm to make sure that they're, to help with the bleeding, when they were doing the cutting, and it's a little bit scary. But in any event, they told me that they had to put an IV in my foot. And my first reaction was like, oh my goodness, like in my foot. I said, that sounds like that would be really painful. And I said, is there another alternative? And they said, well, we either use your foot or your neck. And when they said neck, and I thought about a needle in the neck, I immediately had what I considered a flashback and an emotional trigger. And I very quickly had a very strong emotional reaction, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And I said, no, let's stick with the foot. Now, what happened for me as part of that emotional trigger was they said, we can put it in your neck, and I can still feel the experience now. My heart started to race. I said no. I got hot, feeling flush, and I panicked a little bit. And what was happening was when they said we could put it in your neck, I thought back to the time when my dad was just in the hospital, in the ICU, undergoing this type of a dialysis that requires them to put a very long, I'm talking long, needle in my dad's neck. And I was there with him when they were doing that. I stayed in the room, and it was torture for him. It was torture for me to witness it happening to him. I still don't even really like talking about it, but it created the emotional trigger for me. So when they said we could put it in your neck, it immediately launched me back into the time when I remember being with my dad, when I remember him going through that, and the response that I was having as the person watching this, right? Because I couldn't do anything, and I felt trapped, and I felt paralyzed, and I wanted to leave, but I had to stay, and it was traumatic. Okay, so like seriously, I needed to take a minute with that one because it really launched me back to that time. And so I want to talk a little bit about, what the emotional trigger is. It's when you think of something that reminds you of your grief, that reminds you of maybe some trauma that you experienced with your grief. And again, when we talk about trauma is anything that you deem to be traumatic. So two people can witness the same situation. One person can be traumatized by the situation, and the other person might not be. So again, your trauma and what you might have experienced, the things that are most challenging about your grief, are traumatic. So my sister is a doctor, and so her seeing that same event of them putting the line in my dad's neck might not be as traumatic for her as it was for me. Now, keep in mind, I was by myself. There wasn't anybody around. We were at the point where we were really scared for his life. And so the thing about the emotional trigger for me is that it threatened my sense of safety and security, because I was like, what would I do? What if he dies? What if this goes wrong? How will I handle this? This was my concern and my inability to know how I was going to handle the situation that I deemed so overwhelming. And so that's what a trigger is. And it comes on really, really quickly. So you'll know when it happens. If you've experienced an emotional trigger, I want you to say, yes, it's me. And I want you to drop down below, what was your trigger? Another trigger that I had that I worked on using EMDR, which is a methodology that therapists use to help people through trauma. You can look it up. I have other videos on it. Was the time when I had to leave my son. So they had decided that they were going to transport him. It was the first time that I had seen him when he was a day old, because I hadn't seen him yet. So I had to literally go meet my son, say hello to him, and let them take him away in that very same moment. And that was a big trauma for me because I was scared. What if he dies and I'm not there? That was the fear for me. That was the overwhelm for me. And so it's the same thing whenever I send my current son. I remember when I sent him to preschool for the first time, when I sent him to kindergarten for the first time, when I sent him to, 5th grade for the first time when we were here in Virginia. I have those same reactions and the reactions come up. And so that's what triggers are. And so when it happens, sometimes it comes out of the blue and you don't know it. You don't know that that's what's happening. And so what I want you to do when that does happen is there's an opportunity for you to think about your trigger, to work through your emotional trigger and to understand it. Because I think anything that we don't inherently understand brings us fear and creates anxiety for us. So if you know you have an emotional trigger and you're worried that it's just going to happen again, that's a problem, right? Because you need to know, okay, it might happen again because it likely will. Again, like with my son, preschool, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, right? It happens over and over again. And so, but now I'm better equipped and I know how to handle it. And so here's the things that you do when you know you're triggered, when you're having that response. First thing you need to do is stop. You need to remove yourself from whatever the situation is, if you can. Right? Recognize saying this is a trigger, stop. You can even use the words saying stop. You need to stop and take a deep breath. Take a pause. So that's really the first thing. And then after you remove yourself, you stop and you pause, you take a deep breath. And then when you are feeling calm and when you are feeling better, I want you to spend some time thinking about it. Think about what you were thinking about when that trigger happened, and what was the fear. You need to name and identify what the fear is, what happened, what was the traumatic event that sent you for a loop. What is the traumatic event? What was the thought? What went off in your head? The smell, the emotion, whatever it is, the situation. What was the situation that sent you into a tizzy? Because once you know what that is, you can start thinking about it. And you can say, right, I can say very logically for my son now, when I drop him off anywhere, I know that that reaction is going to happen. And that's okay. But now I know to say, okay, I'm having this reaction. I know that he is inherently going to be okay. This is my fear for his safety that is driving my response. And I can get through this. Now, the emotional trigger with my dad and the neck thing, that probably isn't likely going to happen again. There are other emotional triggers around my dad's passing that I do have to pay attention to. Every time I go to my sister's house and I look across the room where he was when I held his hand as he passed is an emotional trigger, right? And I can take a deep breath and I can say, well, of course, I'm having this response because it happened right here. And it was one of the biggest life events that I've ever experienced. And so taking a minute, thinking through it, saying, this is why I'm having this reaction, saying it's okay, and not feeding the fear, not feeding the anxiety, not making it worse. And if you need someone to talk through it, then I want to encourage you to do that. You could journal through it. You could just think through it. You could speak through it. Like for me, when I speak to you, speaking through the situations helps me, right? Sharing it when we get together in our grief groups, sharing what the triggers are and what happened. Just inherently hearing yourself speak it and sharing it with other people helps alleviate some of the fear and alleviate some of the trauma that goes along with it. So I hope this video helps you. Again, I want you to take care of yourself, right? Know that you are not going crazy, that emotional triggers are very real. Please share your emotional triggers here. Let other people know what's going on with you. And again, feel free to join my Facebook community, All Things Grief Inspired. You can find me there. And stay tuned because I have some pretty exciting things that are coming up. So if you want to jump into my next grief course, I want to encourage you to reach out to me because I'm taking lists for who wants to be in that next one that's coming up soon. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next video.